Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the next scientific briefing, which will be led by Barry Duplantis, the Senior Director of Business Development for AET. And please give him a warm round of applause for his presentation.
Thanks for the introduction, and as mentioned, my name is Barry Duplantis, and it's my pleasure to present end-to-end AI applications for advanced antibody engineering. We've actually prepared a series of 4 different case studies that exemplify our ability to perform an iterative design process using our AI-guided approaches. But before I jump into these case studies, we want to give a little bit of background on the company and the platforms that obviously enable these case studies to become a reality. So AET is actually the wholly owned subsidiary of a company called Crystal Pi. Crystal Pi has been around for approximately 11, 12 years, and in that time period has raised just under $1.3 billion. So the company originally was focusing on in silico small molecule structure prediction before moving into small molecule discovery, solid state chemistry and automation. And then in 2019, AET, the then biologics division of Crystal Pi, was built up. So a little bit about AET itself. We have over 100 employees, and from a researcher perspective, we actually have a 2-to-1 biologist to AI scientist or wet lab to dry lab ratio. We really like to emphasize this because unlike a lot of other companies in this space, we were really built from the ground up to integrate these AI ML tools into our wet lab capabilities. All the scientists sit together in this 30,000 square feet lab space that we have, and this setup has essentially enabled the development of 3 different AI engines that we stand on that have produced 3 core different applications. In the 5 years that we've been running, we've worked with over 30 different partners and run 5 different internal programs. And each of these internal programs that we're developing is addressing a technical challenge that our platforms can help overcome. From a partnership perspective, ones that we're publicly allowed to announce, we've signed deals with J&J, UCB, and then recently a $345 million deal with Lilly. So this slide is actually a good representation of the infrastructure that we feel has led to an industry-leading tech stack. So starting with that 30,000 square feet of lab space on the bottom that I've already mentioned, we like to really emphasize the fact that AET's wet lab capabilities alone would allow us to compete as a premier engineering and discovery platform in its own right. But where we really do differentiate is how we integrate our AI and ML tools into that process. So the wet lab is obviously used for engineering and discovery purposes, but we've also used it to produce this Atlas database, which can be seen on the left-hand side. This is an internal proprietary database that we have put in a lot of time and energy to produce, characterize, and curate the data sets. And this data, along with publicly available data, is what has been used to create our AI engines. The AI engines can be broken down into a folding module and design modules. From the folding module perspective, CrystalFold, this is our protein-protein complex structure prediction algorithm. So starting with primary sequence of an antibody and an antigen, or 2 proteins, or even a peptide and a protein, we are able to produce highly accurate protein complex structures in a relatively high throughput manner, and then this can serve as the downstream foundation for our engineering work. From a generative perspective, we have ZenProt. This consists of large language model as well as inverse folding modules. Very simplistically, like ChatGPT can take a sentence or an essay or your email, and based off of prompts and constraints, can alter that email to something that you prefer more. If we have a starting protein sequence based off of prompts and constraints, we can produce new sequences. But it's really important to note that the sequences that are being produced by the generative AI are what we call fit. Since it's been trained on our developability data, we're only producing sequences with favorable developability properties because there's no point in fixing one issue and introducing other ones. The third one is Zentient. This is our predictive suite of AI tools. So in essence, a hit generation program can produce sequences. An engineering program, XenProt, can produce sequences. We use Zentient and our predictive suite of tools to down select, to filter, to identify the lead candidates that possess the multiparametric requirements that today's programs need. So we found that these AI pillars have led to certain applications where we can really differentiate ourselves. That would be hard targets, advanced engineering, or multi-specifics design. From a hard targets perspective, we classify these as ion channels, GPCR agonists, epitope-specific discovery in some situations. But we like to emphasize the fact that we're not just creating binders to these hard targets. We can actually create fairly deep functional libraries that really allow us to produce antibodies of interest. From an advanced engineering standpoint, this is true multi-parametric optimization. We're dealing with multiple parameters that we're looking to improve, or any other type of engineering task where the search space is so vast that traditional technologies don't seem to be able to apply. The final is multi-specifics design. We've created a high-throughput SCFV optimization platform. So converting IgGs into the SCFVs, maintaining affinity, improving developability and stability. And in addition to that, we've also developed our own common light chain platform. In this situation, we can identify common light chains through the discovery process from overlapping NGS data sets. But if we're also given a parental antibody with different light chains, we can create new light chains while also ensuring affinity and developability along with those programs. So the reason that we like to bring up both was as the complexities of multispecifics continues to drive, we do have the flexibility to balance biology and modality to make sure that we're producing the best assets. So that brings me to the platform applications, or the 4 case studies that we're going to present today. The first one is an epitope-specific VHH design, or essentially the conversion of an IgG into a VHH. The next one is a mouse cross-reactivity engineering case study. Essentially, we're looking to impart mouse binding into an antibody that previously did not have any. pH sensitivity engineering, where we're actually looking at both inter and intra pH modulation to create that pH selective effect. And then finally, multiparametric SCFV optimization. So the first case study in epitope-specific VHHs. So the ultimate goal of this program was actually to create a multi-specific that incorporated a VHH into the construct. But the building blocks that we had were only functional IgGs. So the first step was actually to convert the IgG into a VHH. So the quick snapshot of this case study is we were able to leverage a resolved crystal structure to provide structural information. We then performed 2 rounds of AI-guided design. We actually expressed a total of 115 VHHs, and then we essentially produced a panel of epitope-specific, high-affinity, sequence-diverse VHHs to then be moved into the multi-specific design. This slide that I'm presenting now is essentially a good encapsulation of our iterative design process, or lab in the loop, as a lot of people like to say. That was used in this program, but also in a lot of the engineering programs that we perform. So like most programs, it does start with a structural analysis. In this situation, we did have a crystal structure that we could leverage, but when we do not have those crystal structures available to us, we can use our folding module, CrystalFold, to provide the same level of information. Based off of our in silico analysis, we identified 2 to 4 different key residues in the HCDR3 that were required to be maintained to give us our functional binding. These residues were then placed as constraints within the design module XenProt. XenProt then produces these 10,000 fit sequences that I was mentioning before. These fit sequences are then filtered down through our filter module that includes our developability, affinity predictions, but then we're also using CrystalFold to ensure that we're getting the appropriate epitope throughout the course of the program. From this iterative loop, we identified 45 VHHs of interest, and we expressed and tested those in the wet lab. We then collect that data and then create a project-specific fine-tuned AI module. We then run our second iterative design process through the same process and then identified 70 VHHs to be expressed and characterized. So when we actually look at the data outputs from these 2 rounds of engineering, in round 1, we expressed 45 VHHs. We ended up with 32 binders for approximately 71% hit rate. The top clone had a binding affinity of approximately 2 nanomolar. In the second round, using that fine-tuned AI module, we expressed 70 VHHs. We resulted with 64 binders for approximately 91% binding rate, and the best clone had 100 picomolar binding affinity. Of those 64 binders, 69% of them had affinities better than that 2 nanomolar. Of those 44, 100% shared the appropriate epitope, and then 100% also had the desired functionality. We then actually selected 11 VHHs to move forward for further development. And then when you look at the average sequence identity of those 11 candidates back to the parental antibody, there was 38% identity in the HCDR1, 25% in HCDR2, and 10% in the HCDR3. So when you take a quick snapshot or summary of this program, essentially we were able to convert an IgG into a panel of VHHs that were epitope specific, that were sequence diverse, that were high affinity, and that actually were also very developable. And then these could serve as components going into the multi-specific design. So that's going to bring me to the next case study for mouse cross-reactive engineering. In this situation, we were actually looking to introduce mouse binding into a parental clinical stage antibody for the use of simple in vivo rodent studies. So the design goals started with essentially trying to maintain the nanomolar range affinities to human, maintain the same nanomolar ranges to cyno, or at least stay within a 2-fold difference, but then essentially establish binding of mouse to within a 5-fold difference of that human and cyno binding. And this was from a parental antibody that showed no detectable mouse binding whatsoever. So in this case study, we actually leveraged more wet lab and dry lab components to get the desired outcomes of interest. But the workflow remains essentially the same. We started with structural modeling to identify a key interface. We then used this information to create guided yeast display libraries. This yeast display library approach yielded a single weak mouse binder. This weak mouse binder then went into our AI-guided iterative design loop, which then produced 4 top candidates that bound human, cyno, and mouse. So the main complexity or the main difficulty associated with this program was actually the level of divergence between the human and the mouse epitopes. So the image on the left shows the structural modeling and the interface analysis of the human and mouse complexes. And then this actually revealed that there was greater than 40% divergence across multiple regions of the epitopes. So the figure on the right is actually just a little bit more illustrative, and the gray boxed out areas are regions of divergence and then their corresponding affected CDRs. So when you actually break out the numbers and you look at the 40% divergence between the mouse and the human and the 5 affected CDRs in framework, the theoretical search space for this program actually exceeds 10 to the 50 variants. So the only reason we bring this up is just to kind of emphasize the level of complexity that we were dealing with. So when initially looking at the yeast display, we actually created a number of libraries targeting different CDRs based off of our initial structural information. The initial pannings did not produce any mouse binder from this. We then actually created a rational combination of these sublibraries, repeated pannings, and we were actually able to produce a single weak mouse binder of about 100 nanomolar to mouse, but approximately 1 nanomolar to human. So this weak mouse binder was then run through 2 iterations of our AI-guided design process. In the first round, we were actually looking to enhance both the mouse affinity and the human affinity. In the second round, we were just looking to further enhance the mouse affinity. But just to re-emphasize kind of the process, we use CrystalFold, the folding module, to get our structural modeling and information. We use ZenProt to get the generative design and the new sequences. We use Zentient to down-select and identify the sequences of interest. We then perform the wet lab work to characterize and obtain the data required to make the project-specific or the fine-tuned AI module for the secondary round. So the original weak mouse binder had 7 mutations. For the first round of optimization, we allowed the generative model to go up to 11 different mutations. And then after getting our AI fine-tuned, we allowed it to go up to 13 different mutations. So then when we actually look at the data, the graph on the left is the representation of both round 1 and round 2. The y-axis axis represents the human affinity. The x-axis is the mouse affinity. You can see the parental clone on the far left, and then the subsequent yeast display-produced weak binder in the square box. In round 1, you can see that we were able to successfully increase both human and mouse affinity, at least to a certain degree. But then in the subsequent step with the AI-guided module, we then were further able to balance those affinities out. Ultimately, we produced 4 clones that hit the design goals set out from the outset of the program. But it's also important that not only do we hit the affinities that we were looking for in terms of the species, but we also were able to maintain the epitopes. We maintained potent cell binding, and we also had a favorable developability profile of all 4 of these clones. That's going to bring me to the next case study, which is pH-sensitive engineering. So there's been a lot of talk lately and a lot of discussions around the use of pH-selective binding to potentially impart half-life extension in antibody therapeutics. Not going to go into a ton of detail in it in this talk, but very simplistically, antibodies bind the antigen at neutral pH. When endocytosis occurs, the acidified nature of the endosome then causes dissociation of the complex. This allows the antigen to be trafficked for lysosomal degradation, where the antibody is then bound by FcRn and allowed to recycle, thus extending the half-life. The figure on the right is an example of one of these pH-engineered antibodies that ALUX has produced, and it's actually the end result of the case study that I'm going to show. But essentially what we're showing is pH-sensitive binding with association at pH 7.4 and then dissociation at pH 5.5. And then you can see the faster dissociation of the blue curve on the bottom. The goal, like generally speaking, the goal of pH engineering programs is to create the largest free energy difference between a neutral pH and acidic pH as possible. We typically rely on the unique features of the epitope to accomplish this. And then in addition, obviously, histidine is the only amino acid that has the charge variability of interest within the range. So it has also become incredibly critical to the pH selective engineering process. But very simplistically, if an epitope contains a positively charged residue like lysine and arginine, introducing a histidine will initiate that charge repulsion at a pH less than 6. Or if a histidine is present within the epitope, introducing a lysine or arginine mutation will also put that charge repulsion in at a pH of less than 6 as well. However, in some situations, the residues available at the binding interface are not appropriate to confer the substantial pH sensitivity that we're looking for. In this case study, the epitope was actually dominated by negatively charged residues. So this makes reducing binding affinity through the use of electrostatic repulsion in acidic conditions very difficult. And there was also only a single histidine that was buried at the interface, and it was also not sufficient for imparting the level of pH sensitivity that we were looking for. So in this program and other programs where the lead candidate is not compatible with traditional engineering techniques, we have to use more advanced techniques that combines both inter and intramolecular pH modulation. So I'm going to present this in a stepwise fashion, though in reality, this likely happens in parallel. But when we're looking at the initial intermolecular charge repulsion that was present for us, taking advantage of that single histidine at the buried interface, performing the lysine mutation and getting that charge repulsion only imparted a partial or modest pH selective effect. This then led us to having to use our secondary approach, which is actually a unique CDR steering through intramolecular charge pairs. So in this situation, we leveraged our structural modeling and our AI-guided design to take advantage or leverage both attraction and repulsion within the antibody itself to physically steer the CDR away from the interface at a pH of less than 6. But you can also imagine that doing something like this can perturb the antibody-antigen interaction quite significantly. So the final step in this program was to then enhance the affinity at pH 7.4 while maintaining that pH sensitivity. And then once again, using our structural modeling and our AI-guided design approach, we were able to identify 2 further mutations that did allow the enhancement of affinity at 7.4 while maintaining this pH selectivity. We then took this. I've actually already shown the pH-dependent binding curves of this at the beginning of the case study, but we then took this antibody and ran it through in vivo rodent studies. And as you can see, the half-life was extended as based through serum antibody concentrations in transgenic mice. And we do like to point out that this is not just a one-and-done situation. We have applied these techniques to other antibodies as well. 2 that we can share is risankizumab on the left-hand side and lebrikizumab on the right-hand side. And both of these engineering projects took advantage of both the inter-antibody-antigen charge repulsion, but also the intra pH modulation in being able to steer that CDR away from the interface. That's going to bring me to the final case study, and this is a relatively quick one focused on multiparametric SCFV optimization. So as SCFVs become a more critical component of multi-specific design, we wanted to show our ability to optimize them for both binding properties, but also for developability properties through this iterative design process. And so this is a really quick snapshot, and the figure on the left is basically showing 3 different parameters that we were taking into account while optimizing this molecule. TM is represented on the y-axis and relative affinity on the x-axis, and then the size of the circle is actually how we represented the risk of PTMs in this situation. And once again, as you can see, through the design cycles, we were able to guide the lead candidate towards and then finally into the target product profile that we were looking for. But not only were we actually looking at those 3 different components while running the program, we were also looking to optimize or maintain cyno-cross reactivity, immunogenicity risk, PI profile, protein expression, and then also looking at IP situation as well. So to summarize the talk, we can use accurate structural modeling to unlock diverse applications for antibody design and engineering. There's also a synergistic integration of fine-tuned AI models to enable efficient multiparametric optimization. And then advanced engineering applications can support novel therapeutic ideas like half-life extension. I'd also like to point out, if you're interested more hearing about ALEX in general, my colleague will be giving a presentation in the exhibit hall tomorrow at 2 p.m., and I'm happy to take any questions.
Does anyone from the audience have any questions at all?
Yeah.
What is the in this parental binding affinity?
About 50 picomolar.
So you at the end you are
about 100 picomolar.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So you basically preserve the.
Yeah, we did pretty well in preserving the overall affinity of the IgG.
Yeah. Okay. And 100. Okay. For the single chain engineering, that more and more of the multi-specific bispecific, there's a need for single chain, and often case that IgG converted into single chain, you lost binding affinities and all different things that can.
Yeah.
How realistic in your platform be able to get the single chain work as well as the parental?
We've been very successful. I mean, it hasn't been 100%, but I'd say at least over 80% of the time we've been successfully able to convert and have binding affinities and stabilities within a range that would be appropriate for a further multi-specific construct.
And if you can you share that what kind of strategy you implement this?
To do this?
By adding
I mean, we do actually. Yeah. No, I mean, a lot of the issues when converging is obviously you're exposing new regions of the molecule that would have been buried before. So a lot of times you end up with hydrophobic patches that were previously buried are now exposed. So a lot of the strategies come and have been developed to make sure that obviously we can, maintain binding, maintain stability, but by addressing the hydrophobic regions that now are exposed in the SCFV construct, we can produce a highly stable output.
Okay, thanks.
So the first part of the talk, what was the rationale of converting MAB into a nanobody?
Sorry? Oh, why did we do for which one? Sorry?
So the first talk where you develop a nanobody out of a MAB?
Yeah.
So
why did
I'm
we
just
do that?
curious, what was
it? Was actually, it was a partner program that was brought to us, and the building blocks that we had were just IgGs. We did discuss the concept of going back and running in another discovery program with VHHs, but they actually wanted us to go forward with the engineering. So there is a balance. A lot of times, though, and we have had that question, and we've asked the question ourselves, but a lot of times companies will have, clinical antibodies that they want converted for further multispecifics, and in those situations, they don't want to go back and try to make a surrogate to the clinical one. They will just want this one converted.
Thank you. And then I have another question. If you have to reverse it back, if you have a nanobody and if you have to convert to MAB, would that be possible with your platform?
It would be possible. It's been talked about, but it hasn't actually been performed. We generally think that it would actually probably be easier, to be totally honest, to go the other way around if we're starting from VHH going to IgG, but we haven't actually run that program yet.
Thank you.
Do we have any more questions from the audience? No? Okay, well, thank you very much. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, I'm good.
Great, thank you so much. We now have a 10-minute break before the next session starts, and let's give one more big round of applause for our speaker here.